If you haven't seen the first video, you'll probably want to look at that before you check this one out. Otherwise, you're probably not going to understand a thing that I'm saying. This is meant to be a supplement to cover what I didn't talk about and what I did want to talk about while I was working on the video, but I got cut for time. If you want something a little more digestible and better structured, that's why I made the first one. I also hope you like Deadlock, because there's going to be a lot of it here, but I'll add visual aids when I need to, so it's not boring for anyone watching that's still interested. Anyway, to start, we need to address a pretty big elephant in the room that I didn't talk about in the original, which is that when a lot of people complain about localization, they actually tend to mean that they didn't like the voice acting. I didn't really consider that a part of the process I wanted to talk about, but it's still kind of as important because you can have the best localization ever made, and it won't mean squat if the guy directing the VAs don't know what they're doing or just don't care. It's hard to really ever say that the voice actors themselves are the problem, but there can still be mismatches either because the voice doesn't match the age or the feeling of the original is just not there. But even then, that's also not grounds to establish some binary critique where if the VA doesn't sound like the Japanese version, then it's automatically bad, because that's just so close-minded. Since we talked a little bit about Kiki's delivery service, we can use Gigi as an example, since they were originally voiced by Rei Sakuma, which compared to Phil Hartman's take on the role was drastically different. Phil would always try to fill the dead air with a wisecrack, whereas Rei would be a lot more reserved in when Gigi actually talks. But which version is the better one? If you asked me, I'd say that's mainly up to objective taste. I grew up with the Hartman version, so of course that's the one I'm a lot more familiar with, and that's also why I tend to be confused when I see some people complain about it. Because they tend to hyperfixate a little too much on the nuances of two obviously different directions that just seems like that's the only issue they have, where they wanted Gigi to only sound like the version they grew up with. The way I want to explain where I take a stance on the discussion is to look at one of the more important parts of the film, where Kiki can't hear Gigi anymore because she's losing her powers, and that makes her freak the fuck out. And it's only through being allowed to calm down and stop overthinking what her role in life is supposed to be that she is able to get those powers back. And then there's this part at the end that I find pretty interesting, where this happens after we already see that she can fly again. That little detail is not at all present in the VHS release, since they just give him a single line to let the viewer know that he can talk again. And after comparing the two, it totally makes sense why there's less value out of the Disney version, since there's nothing to really think or talk about after that little scene, which the later releases acknowledged and changed to better resemble the original while still having the same voice actors. Almost like the voices weren't the problem here. I'm gonna move on to talk about this blog post by Jerry S. Taylor that definitely helped me in my original video, where they were talking about a blatant double standard and how people criticize bad localizations, and they were using ghost stories as the primary example. I kind of regret not including this discussion, since there's apparently a false narrative that the reason why the dub exists was that the show didn't do well in Japan, so the director was given the clear to do whatever they wanted, and it's only now that we know that this just isn't true. That also raises a pretty important question about how little we actually respect creator intent, despite never shutting the hell up about its importance. Taylor also wanted to look at a more modern example of this double standard as well, so they took a look at the localization for a show called Mr. Osomatsu, which arguably had even more egregious examples than the other stuff I've seen so far, but the early episodes did actually really well in reception despite this problem. At least that was the case until one episode where one of the characters said SJW, and then like clockwork, it suddenly became tainted goods to these people. And at this point, one might ask why someone would claim that creator intent is paramount to localization if they're just not going to treat it like it's a spit in the face of the artist until an oddly specific and inoffensive aspect of their local culture bleeds into the content they watch. It's truly an unsolvable mystery why they behave this way. Creator intent also tends to not really matter a lot when it's representing a minority, which is also a topic that's fairly new, but also not really, because there's been some cool examples like Tokyo Godfathers, which is the best movie ever made, and that stuff has tons of trans rep in it. That's not to say that Japan has been really good at that kind of stuff. If anything, their portrayals up into the late 2010s were horrible at handling minorities. And this is where I also have a big problem with modern localization, because they still use the old way of handling sensitive topics where they just remove it altogether. I've seen some companies like Atlas getting praised by the media for sanding those edges off in Persona 3 Reload because it got a lot of bigots pissed off about it, but it kinda sucks because it made it nigh impossible to really explain why someone wouldn't like this change without looking like a bigot themselves. A lot of people understand that the inclusion of hateful and problematic media in preservation isn't specifically because it's endorsed by anyone who preserves deserves it. But it's because we are aware that being able to look, feel, or experience something with a particular cultural context is an excellent exercise for media discussion. It makes you have to actually think about what you engage with and if it might also end up being just as bad in the future. And if so, how are you supposed to respond to that when it happens again? It's going to be a lot harder to have that kind of analysis in media when the constant answer is to whitewash the experience altogether. But a silver lining in this is that the original game still exists. Like, it never went away, even if the company is long done with it. And as long as people care about this stuff, we'll preserve every version we can so we can ensure this conversation is allowed to happen, because it is important to have. I also think to add on to this subject, something should be said about how internet discourse as of late has become incredibly disingenuous with how it criticizes media. I've noticed that the objective of conversation on the internet has kinda stopped being about the conversation itself, and more about how long you can keep the conversation going with you at the base of all of it, so you can maximize that ad, watch time, checkmark, or even CCV revenue. And anybody with half a brain can kind of understand that the easiest way to make someone keep paying attention to you and to raise a bigger audience to your discussions as fast as possible is to constantly piss them off. Like, Dean Takahashi became a household name simply by playing Cuphead like a lobotomite, and as far as I know, even journalists in his own field like Jason Schreier hate his work because he's constantly spreading misinformation about the field. And yet this guy gets to continue being a well-paid journalist because you fools keep clicking on his employer's website and keep watching his crap to see what stupid thing he said this time. And I have to assume people aren't really entertained by this song and dance either, because there's only so many times someone can see another video blatantly trying to blame the state on the industry on some woman or some buzzword that means nothing before they just stop engaging with the content altogether, since they know it's not even really worth their time to look at. And this is where you might see the term toxic positivity also pop up a lot in conversations. This is usually because the self-proclaimed critics of the arts tend to not like it when you criticize them back, but it's also been a really effective thought-terminating cliche to just call the person that didn't like your video a mindless consumer. And that's just so fucking rich coming from people that made being the face of consumerism their entire personality. But I digress. I've seen so many people go out of their way to make these bombastic claims that their choice to like something they don't, or to not buy a game they want you to buy, is actively killing the entertainment industry and that they should feel bad about it. But that's just such a weird pressure to be putting on random people. I always get the impression that they think that the only deciding factor on how something is created is voting with your wallet. And that's just stemming from a complete ignorance on how stuff is made. Because there's tons of hoops you gotta jump through in a company just to get something through. Because you gotta deal with shit like siloing, fighting tooth and nail to convince corporate that your idea will make them money, watch it get rejected anyway so they can go for the short-term profit after their last idea they crunched the fuck out of can be caught up before their shareholder notices. And yeah, maybe voting with your wallet might actually convince those data analysts that people like to have the cool idea over more slop, but that's not going to convince the people that actually have the power over what gets released. It's just not in any way a constructive conversation to be acting like the state of the industry is all the consumer's fault. But people keep doing it anyway because it's just easier to attack each other before we attack the actual problem. That's kind of why I'm particularly picky with my critics, because it just pointlessly creates a wedge in these discussions if not kill them outright just for a couple dollars. I don't really have anything else to add, but I did at the end of the video entertain the thought of unionization in the localization industry, and I didn't quite give any time to talk about the unions that are actually around, so I wanted to shotgun a couple here. You got the National Writers Union, which has a literary translators division that helps improve the working conditions for writers that localize works. There's the News Guild Communication Workers of America, which was founded in 1933 by newspaper journalists, and they work with spoken language and sign language interpreters. Interpreters United is also a pretty big organization that helps places like Washington State, among other public agencies, to provide fair working standards, and those are only looking at just American unions. That said, the other big obstacle about why I imagine anime localization isn't unionized that I haven't talked about is due to the contract that these employees sign up for. Contract employees are almost damn near impossible to unionize because of how independent contractors are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act that allows unions in the first place. Since independent contractors are more or less the standard for a lot of these places, there's pretty much zero negotiation power. But through more public exposure to the system and that industry correction due to the labor shortage we talked about, those protections have gotten a little bit better since the 2000s. But it's still not even close to the standard you'd really expect out of a bilingual. The prison school controversy also incentivized Funimation at the time to hire more localizers and to start actually being more transparent about the whole system, which in the short term skyrocketed the application rate of the localization field. But as we unfortunately know now is that in the long term, it made it really hard to stay in this occupation as a professional. There's been this nasty trend as of late in the industry where there's always this weird expectation that you have to do a little bit more than what your title says you do. And it's kind of the same issue for translators, where the companies see seek out people that can not just translate well, but can also be fast at comedy or researching the cultural context of a different country, all within the insane time span they give them, so the viewer can ethically watch Rudy as Grey Rat sexually assault every underage girl he meets in Renoa. Rudy, you gotta watch out! There's an unsupervised minor in the bottom of the plaza! There's also an added pressure from the licensors because they didn't want to have another prison school dub, so it's also a common practice to just have the process go through dozens of arbitrary approvals that took away the autonomy of this field. This knee-jerk reaction to something that was as easily fixable as a redub created this revolving door of employees that come in, get fucked over, and then leave. This is not a sustainable practice, and I think a case can be made in today's economy that maybe that's the point, so that they can manufacture consent for the use of AI since nobody wants to work anymore. I could also go on about AI or talk about how Google literally said it's not meant to be a replacement for translators, or even maybe talk about that one Pokemon leak from 2024 where a bunch of people tried doxing a scriptwriter for that Typhlosion lore piece, but they couldn't find anything because the AI they used to translate the docs made the name up. But I'm tired, and I think I made my point on the first video. I really don't have anything left to talk about. Maybe to check out some of the shows I talked about, maybe even give some of them a rewatch, or you just check out the different localizations like the Ocean Dove or Dragon Ball Z. I hear that Goku's VA in that is actually Reed Richards and Marvel Rivals, so that's cool. Other than that, I think I'm probably gonna head out and just go back to looking at jobs on Glassdoor, because that's a fucking part-time job in of itself now.
Check it out, I'm in the house like carpet. And if there's too many heads in my carpet, I won't spark it out, put it in my carpet, and save it like carpet. View to everybody's gone and it's cool. Then I spark it up with my carpet. His mama named him Carpet, but I call him Carpet Lover, and he's more than a carpet, he's a quilt. We're putting shit together like that carpet that John built on a carpet. Cause this shit gonna feel like carpet, turtle.